After having such a positive experience with Warren Ellis's first volume of Astonishing X Men, I went into his second arc, Exogenetic, expecting something along the same lines of quality. I don't know if it was because I went in with higher expectations than I did with Ghostbox, or if Ellis actually tries to change his writing style when he is working with a different artist, as the artist on this book, Phil Jimenez, said that Ellis does. But whatever the case may be, I did not come away from Astonishing X Men Volume 6 with the same level of excitement as I did the previous volume. The first major difference between Exogenetic and its predecessor is the tone and pacing. While Ghostbox felt very slow and contemplative, Exogenetic feels like a big fast action movie. Ghostbox maybe had a ratio of 80% high concepts and thought-provoking conflict, with 20% action to satiate the action junkies buying the book. Exogenetic almost feels like it flips that ratio, with 20% of the book dedicated to character interactions, concepts that made me love Ghostbox so much, and any kind of meaningful conflict. I suppose there is nothing inherently wrong with a big action movie that isn't really about anything, but when I come into a book expecting similar tone and pacing that I got from the previous installment, I can't overlook that disappointment when I don't get that. In many ways, this could be equated to how Bryan Singer directed two very thought-provoking X-Men films that had thematic resonance and strong characters, and then Brett Ratner directed a follow-up film that had neither of these things. There's nothing wrong with loving X-Men 3 if you love loud action movies that are in your face, but it's not easy to accept that about X-Men 3 after you've seen the previous two films that are not that in any way. It is the same basic premise going on here, except that in this case Warren Ellis is the mastermind behind both Ghostbox and Exogenetic, and I have a hard time believing that the same man penned both of these stories. While Ghostbox had some strong character moments for Storm, Beast, and even the villain of the piece, Forge, Exogenetic seems to take a step back by only focusing on Cyclops and to a lesser degree, Beast once again. Cyclops' character arc is deciding if he is going to kill the villain who wants the X-Men and all of mutant kind dead. This might be a fine character arc for him to go through, except that it's hard for me to look at it seriously, since Cyclops has killed before this story came out, and has killed after it came out. This inconsistency with the character's previously established ethical code makes this arc he goes through very superficial, to say the least. Meanwhile, Beast has a golden opportunity to have some kind of redemption from his questionable actions that he went through in the Endangered Species backup stories, which are mentioned in this book. It even seems Beast is going to feel sorrowful for bringing near destruction down on his friends and his entire species, thanks to putting his research into the public after Endangered Species. Instead, Beast goes on the defensive and yells at Scott for considering killing the villain of the book. While I don't mind Beast yelling at Scott, I don't feel like this means that he can't go through an arc himself. I would have felt less shortchanged by this book if Beast and Storm had some scenes together where she chastised him after he chastised Scott, and he maybe realized that there really is a line that a scientist has to draw before he does the things that he does. This would have made an excellent parallel to the villain of the book, Kaga, a man who seemingly has infinite funds, who uses this money and his ingenuity for evil. This failed parallel makes Beast's lack of an arc in this book even more disappointing than simply noticing that he doesn't really get much to do in this book, considering the events could not have happened without his somewhat irresponsible actions from earlier. Speaking of Kaga, let's discuss him for a moment. In the same way that Ghostbox did, this book doesn't reveal the villain until the climax. We find out that he is bitter that the X-Men call themselves mutants when really they look like superstars and are hardly the outcasts that they proclaim to be. He is so outraged by this because he genuinely considers himself a freak thanks to physical mutations he has suffered because of his mother surviving the nuclear attack on Hiroshima, Japan. The X-Men easily defeat this guy with almost no violence at all, which is commendable. I like it when superheroes use their brains to solve problems instead of punching everything that doesn't agree with them. But then they go on to make fun of Kaga and his motivations for wanting them dead. And with good reason. Kaga is mad because the X-Men are prettier than he is, and are more popular than he is. It's been said before that a hero is as good as his villain, and when I look at a story like this, if I didn't already have a great affinity for the X-Men, I would come away thinking that the X-Men are pretty awful if this is the kind of villainy that contrasts against them. While Kaga's villainous schemes are definitely inadequate and petty, these are not my only problems with his quarrel with the X-Men. In Grant Morrison's manifesto he wrote before beginning his lengthy run on the X-Men, he mentioned that it was strange that the X-Men all look like humans and don't really look like mutants at all. This was the purpose of putting actual monstrous-looking mutants into the school, to show that the X-Men like Storm, Cyclops, and Emma Frost, who are all gorgeous human beings to say the least, are not indicative of what mutants look like or go through when you have Beak, Ernst, and Basilisk on the other end of the spectrum. It's one thing for Grant Morrison to mention this incongruity with the X-Men and strive to correct it in his run, but I have an issue with an actual comic book character pointing this out to the X-Men. It even seems like Kaga has to pretend like Beast isn't in the room when he is accusing the X-Men of being too pretty. If Grant Morrison mentions in his notes that there should be more freaks in the mutant community, that's fine, because it's something that really did seem strange before he addressed it. But it does not need to be addressed a second time when Morrison had already corrected for this. And it certainly does not need to be addressed by a fictional character who seems to lose any capability of rational thought when he is flat out ignoring the mutants in the world who are actually physically deformed like he is. Just like in the previous volume, the characters all sound very spot on, which I commend Ellis for. It's a shame they don't get more chances to speak and interact with each other, so that this aspect could shine brighter, as they really feel like they are taking a back seat to the bold, flashy action that this book embodies. Ultimately, I feel like this book is pretty skippable. If you are a hardcore Warren Ellis fan, you probably already have this book in your collection, or my negative thoughts on this book won't stop you from purchasing it. If you are looking to dip your feet into the world of the X-Men, I would recommend skipping this one as it doesn't have a great deal to offer, and if you want something that gives you a good idea of what the X-Men are really about, it isn't really that either. It is mostly just a book that happened but had no consequences of any kind, which seems to be the purpose of the entire Astonishing X Men series, as it exists side by side with the other X-Men titles while not actually interacting with them. All in all, I am sad to say that Astonishing X Men Exogenetic is very skippable for anyone who this book might be targeted toward.